Welcome, everyone. Good morning to week 2 of COP27. My name is Beck. I'm the Senior Director at the Clean Air Force. To Zero Carbon Future, which is hosted by the Clean Air Task Force. We're a global climate organization focused on overlooked solutions for a zero carbon future. And we're hosting Zero Carbon Future, a space here this year, to discuss the nexus of energy access, energy security, and climate in a world of polycrisis. Last week, we focused on region-centric strategies. We zoomed into a new narrative for Europe, new climate and energy security narrative for Europe. We discussed what's next on the US agenda. We also really investigated the future of Africa at the nexus of energy access. Energy access as the first building block for climate mitigation and the first line of defense against climate change. And this week, we're going to zoom into technology-specific pathways. So this is our first event this week. We're going to be discussing hydrogen, the need to mitigate methane, carbon capture and storage, nuclear strategies. And so I'm really, really excited to welcome you. Please follow our conversations. The QR codes for the whole programming this week are on the screens. And you can follow us on Twitter at CleanAirCATF and tweet with the hashtag #ZeroCarbonFuture. So I'm really excited to welcome you to a morning of carbon capture and storage. CATF has been working on carbon capture for over 2 decades. And our focus is really on commercializing the technologies as an option for global decarbonization of industrial facilities, the power sector, and also laying the pathway for technological carbon dioxide removal. And so from our perspective, we've been working on carbon capture and storage, particularly in the US, Europe, and the Middle East, but are also working on region-centric strategies for ensuring global deployment of the technologies. As many of you know, carbon capture and storage is one vital option in our climate, to solve our climate puzzle. So today's first panel is really going to zoom into regional strategies. To really enable the commercialization of carbon capture and storage, we have to reduce costs, enable learning by doing, invest in CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, and really envision the future of a carbon management system where carbon capture and storage helps us reduce emissions from industry, produce blue hydrogen, and also, as I already said, lay the pathway for CDR. Later this week, we're also going to be discussing carbon capture in the Caribbean, as well as CDR here in this pavilion. And later today, there's also going to be an event zooming in into CO2 storage at the Bologna Pavilion. So to the regions, we're going to have a terrific panel and an absolutely unparalleled keynote speaker. In the US, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act form the largest investment in CO2 capture and storage commercialization, close to $20 billion. And according to our very own analysis, this could potentially help to enable a 13-fold scale-up of carbon capture and storage in the US, while also creating thousands of jobs. In Europe, we have been focusing on a European strategy for carbon capture and storage. This is the name of a flagship paper CATF has released earlier this year, and just 2 weeks ago, our very own staff was with Kadri Simpson, who was announced as a regional strategy to be presented next year from the European Commission. So really, really exciting. On Friday, we also hosted the launch of the Carbon Management Center of Excellency in Africa, together with the Nigerian government, to really lay the pathway for indigenous innovation in next mover markets. So with this, I gave you a quick flyover of where we are. We're going to dive deeper into this conversation with the panel. But first, it's my great honor to introduce our keynote speaker, Assistant Secretary Brad Crabtree for Fossil Energy and Carbon Management from the United States government.
Thank you, Lee, and good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks to Lee and the whole Clean Air Task Force team for having such a great presence here at the COP, and for all the work you're doing back home in the United States for us, and of course, here in Europe and globally. I guess I'm not keeping my mic up enough. So as Lee was outlining, advancing economy-wide deployment of carbon management technologies and infrastructure at the scale necessary to really meet our climate challenges is a global imperative. This deployment must occur across complex and often geographically dispersed value chains that involve the capture of CO2 from industrial facilities, power plants, in ambient air in multiple locations that then need to be transported to storage sites, again, across a regional scale. This is a challenge that a lot of the clean energy technologies don't face, is how do we develop these systems in parallel, capture, transport, and storage in a way that works on the ground and is commercially viable. For this kind of deployment to be feasible, we must achieve economies of scale and reduce costs and commercial risk by integrating multiple carbon capture, direct air capture, and future and carbon utilization facilities into CO2 transport and storage hubs. These often will need to span large geographic areas from large regions within countries to international networks that span multiple countries. And there's good news on this front. In Europe, we have the example of the Northern Lights project centered on the North Sea that is nearing commercial operation. They're even commissioning 2 first-of-a-kind CO2 transport ships, and they have several carbon capture projects under development so that the whole system can deploy from capture to transport to storage and ultimately serving multiple countries. We're seeing the same thing in the Netherlands with the Portus project, where the Dutch government, along with the Norwegians, has made that commitment, that financial commitment, and that will focus on collectively serving the industrial facilities around the port of Rotterdam and taking that CO2 to a common geologic storage site. And then we're seeing deployment in Europe in other countries that haven't traditionally been engaged. The EU Innovation Fund is supporting around a dozen large-scale carbon capture and storage projects. Germany is preparing a carbon management strategy, and the European Commission recently announced a communication on carbon capture and storage, which is one more step towards the roadmap that Lee mentioned. We're also seeing progress in Asia. More countries are increasing their commitment to speed development and deployment of both carbon capture and carbon removal technologies. And last year saw the formation of the CCUS, Asia CCUS network. In the Middle East, it's particularly exciting, and we're going to hear about that later. We're seeing movement on carbon capture in multiple countries. There are already 3 facilities operating in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar, responsible for about 10% of global carbon capture and storage today. We also have the example of carbon capture in the steel industry from the UAE, Al Riyadh, which was the first of its kind, and Salah in Nigeria, in Algeria continues to be an example of what can be done with carbon capture at scale. Given the geologic resources, these industry expertise, and the capital that's available in the Middle East, we're seeing the emergence of still more carbon capture in projects. And a promising feature, like in Europe, is that there's a focus on developing large-scale hubs. And I know a number of us were particularly excited here at the COP to learn of the announcement in Egypt or in Saudi Arabia of a new extraordinary hub which is committed to capturing 9 million tons per year of CO2 by 2027 and ultimately topping out at 44 million tons per year by 2035. That is real climate scale. Given that we're meeting in Egypt, it's only appropriate to note that we're also seeing activity emerge here in Africa. I think it's important to note that carbon management here in Africa has to be a strategy that helps increase energy access for the hundreds of millions of Africans who lack access to reliable and affordable electricity and other energy resources. And it has to help serve the economic development and diversification of the continent to increase jobs and opportunity. I was honored, Lee mentioned that Nigeria has announced the African Center of Excellence for Carbon Management Technology and Innovation. Chief Eco was here last week. It was a great honor to announce this with him. We're hard at work at the Department of Energy to figure out ways to support that effort on an ongoing basis along with CATF and other partners. So we're clearly at an inflection point here, both in interest and the number of actual carbon management projects that are going around the world. What I'm particularly excited about, though, is we're moving beyond the one capture project, one pipeline, one storage site model, which was important in the early years, but was absolutely limited in terms of the potential to get to climate scale. And we're now shifting to this strategic hub approach. And so I'll close out here by just talking a little bit about the United States, where we, for the first time, and some of you here in the room played a big part in this, but for the first time in our history, we have a robust, comprehensive, ambitious framework for energy and climate policy that has carbon management at the heart of it. So last year, Lee mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, but even a year before that, Congress passed the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law in the United States. It provides $12 billion for the deployment of carbon management technologies and infrastructure. $2.5 billion of this is for 6 large commercial scale demos, 2 in the industrial sector, 2 for natural gas power generation, and 2 for coal-fired power generation. The legislation also institutionalizes the hub development approach that we're talking about today. For example, there's $3 billion to develop 4 regional direct air capture hubs. Each of those hubs will have to capture from ambient air and store 1 million metric tons or more of CO2 each year. There's also $8 billion for the development of regional clean hydrogen hubs. At least one of those hubs will have to prioritize the production of clean hydrogen, transport, storage, and ultimately end uses of clean hydrogen produced from natural gas with carbon capture. Also, and this I'm particularly excited about, inspired in part by the Norwegians and the Dutch, what they're doing in the North Sea, this same infrastructure bill includes $2.5 billion for the development of regional geologic storage sites. Our team at the Department of Energy is estimating that those funds, partnered with capital from the private sector, will be enough to develop potentially 20 to 40 regional geologic storage hubs to start to span the North American continent with that infrastructure. Each of those hubs will be required, to qualify for the funding, required to store at least 50 million tons of CO2 over the next 30 years. Many of those sites will store much more than that. Complementing the storage is what we call CIFIA. CIFIA is a long acronym for the Carbon Dioxide Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Authority. Julio and Kurt and Lee, we should have thought that through when we were working on that legislation, an easier name to work with. But anyway, it's just over $2 billion that will be partnered with private capital for low interest loans and grants to build out CO2 transport infrastructure. Pipelines, of course, we have 8,000 kilometers of pipelines for CO2 already in the United States, but also maritime, barge, rail, truck, and other types of transport. So then, this is the final legislation I'll talk about, the Inflation Reduction Act, which Lee mentioned, passed in August. And at the heart of this strangely named legislation is over $300 billion in clean energy and industrial tax credits available for a 10-year period. And within that legislation are very powerful enhancements to our U.S. Section 45Q tax credit, which is the tax credit in the United States that's intended to directly incentivize carbon capture, direct air capture, and carbon conversion projects. It increases the credit value for industrial and power generation capture projects to $85 per metric ton, and it increases the credit for direct air capture to $180 a ton. For the first 5 years of any project's operation, they'll get that tax credit as a direct cash payment, which will greatly improve the ability to finance carbon capture projects in the private sector. Taken together, these two pieces of legislation, the infrastructure bill on the one hand passed a year ago, and the Inflation Reduction Act in August, we estimate that they will result in emissions reductions in the United States of 40% by 2030 from 2005 levels. Lee mentioned some additional analysis that was commissioned by the Clean Air Task Force. There's one figure she didn't cite, which is that this analysis estimates that by 2035, this legislation will result in 215 to 250 million metric tons of annual CO2 carbon capture and storage capacity in the United States. So at the high end, we're looking by 2035 at potentially 1/4 of a gigaton of annual geologic storage, which is very exciting. So just to end here, I want to emphasize one thing. This is not just about developing projects in the United States. As I've said last week at other events here at the COP, we need to see projects all over the world. What we have learned from a long, successful history of developing and deploying clean energy technologies is that investments made by one country in incentivizing deployment and the learning and cost reductions that come with that are then other countries benefit as well. And I'll take just a couple of examples. Germany invested enormously in incentivizing solar, and today solar energy is one of the lowest costs of has the lowest costs of almost any form of clean energy in the world. And we all around, whether it's the United States or emerging economies or wherever, benefited from that German investment in solar. And we see the same thing with different Northern European countries investing heavily in offshore wind. The United States and other countries are now following along with the benefits of that innovation and savings. So that's where I see the promise here, is that a rising tide lifts all boats, and to the extent that there's competition, it's friendly competition that advances our collective climate ambition, and I'm very excited about that. So thank you for the opportunity, Lee, to be here, and I really look forward to the panel and the discussion today. It's hard to tell. It sounds loud when you're up there.
I know.
But it isn't back there?
You sounded great.
Okay.
Thank you. Oh, you can sit down, please. All right, thank you so much, Assistant Secretary Crabtree, for this terrific keynote remarks. And I think, you know, we're at an inflection point. So it's really exciting to have this absolutely stellar panel with me today to drill deeper into the inflection point. And I think I just want to invite everyone who's already here. At 11:30, we'll go into the second part of this morning on carbon capture, where we're exactly going to discuss what Brad or Assistant Secretary Crabtree closed out with, and that's how are we going to deploy carbon capture and storage in next mover markets after we have kind of harvested the innovation gains from all the policies that we're working on in the US, Europe, and the projects we've heard about in the Middle East. So with this, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Mohammad Abu Zahra, who's the head of the Middle East and North Africa for the Global CCS Institute. Fahad Alajlan, who's the president of KAPSARC, the King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center in Saudi Arabia. Beth Hardy, the vice president for strategy and stakeholder relations at the International Carbon Capture and Storage Knowledge Center in Canada. Dr. Julio Friedmann, chief scientist at Carbon Direct. And last but not least, our very own Eadbhard Pernot, who is manager for policy in Europe and has been working on a lot of the European policies in Germany and on the European Union level and next mover markets. So really excited to drill into the conversation with him. So let's get started. Julio, let's get started with you. And I'm sorry there's only one microphone, so we'll all share. Let's drill a little bit more deeper into what has been passed in the United States. Unparalleled climate policy, more than $500 billion, as we heard, $12 billion for carbon capture and storage. I would actually say $20 billion, because there's also funding for hydrogen hubs. Lots of jobs, 13-fold increase in carbon capture capacity. What projects are you seeing? How are you seeing this vision emerging, and why is it so impactful globally?
Thank you again. I'm glad to be here and delighted to be with this exceptional panel. There's just so much going on. It's really lovely. And in addition to the measures that you mentioned, it's also worth pointing out the 2 decades of investment in this field that Congress and the U.S. government have made. And in addition to that, the passage of the 2020 Act, which then created a large set of appropriations that allowed the Department of Energy to continue this excellent work. So we've had our feet in the game for a long time. We're seeing a handful of projects moving super fast that have my attention. One of these are the big pipeline projects around the Midwest to capture CO2, mostly from ethanol plants, but also from power plants, some sustainable aviation fuel plants, all these others. It's something on the order of 40 million tons a year of capacity. The biggest of these is 18 million tons of capacity. And it's just going to basically do CO2 capture and transportation as a fee for service and store the CO2. That new business model is underwritten by companies like BlackRock, which is also a change, seeing these really big investors getting into it. Another thing which one could expect, but I'm glad to see, we're seeing a lot of blue ammonia projects and blue hydrogen projects. Part of the reason these two classes of projects are at the front was because they were basically at the edge of financeability under the 2018 provisions. Now under the new provisions in the 2022 bill, these are gaining speed and magnitude, and importantly are anchoring these hubs that we're talking about. We really are seeing a hub infrastructure emerge, and it's being anchored by these kinds of pipeline networks and big projects that make such things possible.
Great, thank you. And I just want to also invite the audience, if you have questions, we're going to make this an interactive discussion. We're so excited all of you are here. So please signal to me if you'd like to jump in with the question. We'll come to you. And thank you so much. Beth, let's go over to you. I think at a dinner on Friday, you highlighted really the need for political economic consensus around regional carbon capture strategies, but also a lot of the progress that has been happening in Canada on this subject. So maybe you can give us the latest update and also how you're seeing this, again, in the global context being impactful.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. So in Canada, you know, we did a lot of work in the United States with the 45Q bill, and the Canadian companies were getting quite worried that there was a competitiveness issue. And companies like Carbon Engineering out of British Columbia, direct air capture, they said, we're leaving Canada, and we're going to work with Occidental Petroleum in the United States because we can get a good benefit there with 45Q, which is even better now with the new amendments. So with that, also the Canadian oil sands companies, which, as we're aware, are very significant emissions in Canada that contribute globally. They also ganged together, I would say, in a positive way, and said to Canada, listen, how are we going to make this work? It was on the skirts of trying to get the Keystone XL pipeline actually happening in Canada. So politically, you're talking, this became a lot of geopolitical pieces that connected carbon capture and storage. It was really interesting to see after so many years, I mean 8 years of the Boundary Dam project in Saskatchewan, now all of a sudden there's this rebirth where the big players are saying, okay, we did it, it's proven, now we really need to do it. And so with that investment tax credit that ended up rolling out in Canada, it's not quite what is happening in the United States, but it does a lot. It's 50% of the capital will go towards the investment of the project. So instead of a production tax credit, it's up front with the investment towards the capital, which actually aligns a lot with what Brad was saying earlier about the capital of these projects being one of the roadblocks that can then be, financed through other countries. So that's what they're looking at in Canada. Unfortunately, this gets reduced by half by 2031 to 25%. Good thing, though, to try and get those projects moving quicker. And so that's a big part of that. I have my notes because I'm just back to work and I don't want to make any number problems, but direct air capture is more, so that's 60%, and transport storage and use is 37.5. All of those will decrease by half in Canada over time. But what's really interesting is that with the new Inflation Reduction Act in the States, the Canadian companies are now saying, oh, you just put this out, Canada, we want more now too. And so I love this. This is really fun, and this is what is going to drive more investments, more action, more discussions on something that before was, well, how are we going to use all the CO2 in nanotubes, and which is also still important, but the big pieces of hubs and transport is going to roll out. And so Alberta is investing in storage hubs that are going to be fantastic. And just want to add to that, you're talking about globally as well, and we'll talk about knowledge sharing a little later, I think, in some of the questions, but with that globally, what you can take from the developing countries and these projects that are going to go, I don't know, 13-fold, I think you mentioned, that is what we need to start looking for, because I can tell you, having been a part of an organization that I guess had its laurels on one project and talking about the proven deployment for so long, there's a lot of one and done on projects, and being able to then take that lessons learned and those things and bring them to other companies is going to be really important for the cost reduction through iteration that Brad mentioned as well. So I'll leave it there, and I would love to talk about knowledge sharing pieces later a bit more.
Great, thank you, Beth. And I want to double down on one important theme that you have mentioned, that there is this kind of positive global spillover from the actions that the U.S. has taken, particularly the Inflation Reduction Act. And it's really, we only have to do innovation once, reduce costs, enable learning by doing so. Really strong first movers that then work with their partners to advance the technologies globally is really important. So we're seeing this play out in Canada. But we're also seeing this play out in a recent partnership between the UAE and the U.S. government on a $100 billion partnership to advance next-generation clean energy deployment, and this includes carbon capture and storage, also in emerging markets. So maybe, Mohammad, if I can come over to you, can you give us, Brad mentioned it earlier, 10% of global carbon capture capacity is actually in the Middle East region. Can you give us a little bit on what's the outlook, what's the regional vision for deployment, especially as carbon capture is getting more attention and we're expecting it also to be a big part of COP28?
Hello? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Leah. I'm very happy to be in this panel and to talk a little bit more about what's going on carbon capture and storage in the Middle East and where we're heading. Now, to start with the higher level, we all kind of like in agreement the last couple of years have been excellent years for CCS. We have seen big announcement globally. The projects in the pipeline 2022 increased by 44% compared to 2021. So that's a good indication globally. Now, if we focus closer on the Middle East, currently we have the projects in Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, which is equivalent to 10%. Then these three countries have then announced their commitment into second and third phase of projects. So, for example, we have seen the Saudi Aramco sustainability report in June, which shows its commitment to 11 million ton per year annually by 2030. Saudi Arabia announced Al Jubail hub, which I think Fahad will be talking more about the situation in Saudi Arabia. In Qatar, they just signed the expansion of the North Field with the commitment of carbon capture and storage in that field as well, with the capacity of around 11 million tons by 2030. ADNOC in the United Arab Emirates, they have their second and third phase plan for 7 million ton CO2 per year. So we see like a great motivation and push for CCS, and we look at the region as being a leader in the oil and gas sector, but also they would like to become a leader when it comes to CCUS and hydrogen. So the aim is to really contribute 18 to 20% of the global market of these technologies, and to use the current available infrastructure, facilities, and knowledge, and convert that from the oil and gas sector to the CCUS and hydrogen. Other countries in the region, they started grabbing also into the CCUS business and hydrogen. Currently, we're running a study in Egypt for the potential hub of CCUS in Egypt together with OGCI. We have a member in Egypt, they're working closely with the government on geological storage. Similarly, in Israel, one of our members also working on geological storage potential in that part of the world. In Oman, there have been some good announcements as well. So we see like a great movement in the region in becoming a full regional hub of CCUS. And of course, the link with the blue hydrogen is very essential and important motivation, in addition to the commitment from the government and the national oil companies on reducing emissions.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to stay in the region with Fahad on the next question, because I think we want to zoom in into Saudi Arabia. There has been a big announcement this week on a carbon capture hub for Saudi. So maybe you can walk us a little bit through this vision, but also CCE initiative, Circular Carbon Economy Initiative, and how you're seeing the strategy evolve to commercialize carbon capture and storage.
So thanks, Lee, for having me as part of this panel. I just wanted to first talk about, CCUS and the strategy in the region around CCUS. So in the beginning, in the mid-2000 and the last decade, the focus has been on pilot projects. So pilot here, pilot there. And then some of these projects were driven by enhanced oil recovery. So that would how we make it economics. Now we're seeing a shift from that. And it has both a domestic context and a domestic, motive, and as well as a global. So on the global side, there is the CBAM, what's happening with the CBAM. And so if you're a big commodity exporter like Saudi Arabia, then part of what you want to do is to be competitive. And that includes reducing your CO2 footprint, and CCS makes sense. So if you're exporting fertilizers to Europe, if you're exporting petrochemical, then that makes sense for you. However, I don't think that's the reason. CBAM is still not yet in effect, and Saudi actually export most of its, commodity to Asia. If you look at it, it's between 70 and 80%, depending on what you're looking at. The domestic context is for me more interesting. And I think if you look at the Saudi submission for the NDCs, the National Determined Contribution, actually CCS is not included. So anything that happens between now and 2030 is actually a bonus. It's not included in the UNFCCC submission. However, moving and looking beyond 2030 is where it gets interesting. Looking at our projection and how you can achieve a net zero scenario for Saudi Arabia, the cheapest way of getting there is actually include CCUS. And it includes CCUS, not a smaller scale. And that's how we put the announcement in perspective. So the announcement was 9 million tons by 2027. This does not include blue hydrogen, which should come in later in 2030. But by 2035, the Jubail hub capacity is expected to reach 44 million tons. Yet, I think Saudi is lucky because the industrial development happen in clusters, and that gives your hub strategy extra, I think, acceleration, because you have, your industrial clusters are basically in 3 cities, Jubail, Yanbu, and Riyadh. And so that helps you. But when we looked at our projection for net zero, we see even in 2040 between 50 and 100 million tons of CCUS. And so to get into net zero, we believe Saudi Arabia and other countries in the region need to pursue CCS much more aggressively. And so that's why the 45Q, the Inflation Reduction Act came, and I think it provided the way. It put in a lot of energy into the discussion around CCS, and we're seeing that by trying to incentivize, emitters to actually capture their emissions and try to build these hubs, and that would reduce the infrastructure costs significantly going forward.
Thank you very much. And I want to highlight one aspect that you mentioned, carbon capture and storage and NDCs. Earlier this year, we released a report where we surveyed 46 countries' NDC for the inclusion of hydrogen, carbon capture and storage, and nuclear. And what we found is that all of these technologies are represented in NDCs, in dozens of NDCs in all regions of the world. So there's really this notion that we are moving towards technology optionality and needing more technologies to have really pathways that enable region-centric decarbonization. So I think I want to summarize. So what we've heard is really the need to reduce costs. We need policies that enable the full value chain of carbon capture and storage. So pilot projects, demo projects, deployment policy, and then of course CO2 transport and storage infrastructure to really make sure that each project, and as many of you know, carbon capture and storage is really a technology that's widely applicable for a lot of different sectors. So very specific incentives might be needed to enable different projects. And I think this has been kind of the basis for how CATF has been working on carbon capture and storage in Europe. So I want to go to you, Eadbhard. Maybe you can tell us a little bit. First of all, I mean, Brad already talked a little bit about the exciting announcements with the Innovation Fund and the latest projects. There's dozens of projects, more than 60 projects in Europe now. But what's the vision? Where do we want to go with the carbon capture and storage strategy?
Thanks, Lee. Good morning, everybody. So in Europe, we very much tried to work backwards and seeing where our overall goal of reaching climate neutrality within Europe is going to be in 2050. And in order to get there, the European Commission has estimated that we're going to need between 240 to 600 million tons a year needs to be captured, utilized, and stored every year by 2050. Currently, we don't have a single commercial full-scale operating facility in Europe. So, well, in the European Union, I mean. So we have a lot of work to do. Now, in the past several years, we've seen up to 60 or so new projects have been announced. We've seen several member states have really taken the lead. The Netherlands, Denmark, they've produced carbon capture strategies. They've developed large-scale, infrastructure in order to build particular storage sites. And we very much looked at the industrial sector as the key focus of where we're going to need carbon capture and storage. And when we look at the industrial sector, it's responsible for about 20% of our total emissions. And these are key sectors that are like cement, steel, chemicals. These are the building blocks for society. And really, when we look at the overall energy transition, there is no climate neutrality, there is no energy transition without an industrial transition, very much so. And carbon capture and storage is going to have to play a really important role within all of this. So within Europe in particular, I think very often we kind of look at it as a sort of monolith. The overall continent as a single entity. The European Union itself is made up of 27 different member states, each with their own different regulations, their own political priorities, their own topographies and different types of economies. And so what we really need is, when we're going to see projects where CO2 is going to be captured in one member state, transported via another potentially, and then stored, you're going to have some sort of overall collaboration. There's going to need to be some sort of coordination, particularly on the infrastructure side. And at Clean Air Task Force, we've done an assessment. We've seen that even if the project's announced today, if we're going to look at try and realize those by 2030, we have a 50% shortfall when it comes to storage capacity. And that's very much the key the key roadblock in Europe currently, is the lack of storage capacity. Now, most of the current projects that have been announced have been in the North Sea. Very much so have been related to the fact that a lot of these governments have the funds available and have the desire to accelerate carbon capture. Now, we've recently seen in the Innovation Fund that there's been a focus on not just on the North Sea projects, but also there's been a project announced in Bulgaria, there's another one announced in Poland. And these are key economies which are also producing massive amounts of emissions in their industrial sector. And that's going to be a real important, is that we very much want carbon capture in Europe to not just be focused on the North Sea, but rather that it needs to be a union-wide and continent-wide, or a region-wide effort. And I think very much so, this is where, feeding into several weeks ago, the Commission had their CCUS forum in Oslo, where Kadri Simpson, the Commissioner for Energy, announced a communication which would basically provide a strategic vision for how we're going to, build out this carbon capture and storage infrastructure in Europe. I mean, and this is really what is needed from a higher level, from the governments, not just from the member states to work with together, but also from the European Commission itself to oversee all of this, sort of making sure that the regulations are working well. And also, if we're going to, some member states may not have the capacity or the storage space available to actually build this infrastructure, but other member states will have overcapacity in sort of their storage space. So we're going to need to find ways in which, to make sure that all of this infrastructure that's necessary gets developed. And very much so, this is why a strategic strategy to build out CCS is very much needed.
Great. Thank you, Eadbhard. And you provided the perfect kind of platform for us to move into the next stage of the conversation. So we have outlined our regional visions, concrete policy proposals. Now it takes 4 to 6 years on average to plan and build a carbon capture and storage facility. This is the implementation COP, where we're really looking to realize projects, have project announcements, but also make sure they're going to go forward. So maybe, Julio, we can start with you. What are the key challenges and barriers that we need to address to really ensure that we can actually get steel in the ground and make sure that we're deploying these carbon capture and storage as soon as possible?
Thank you. This is the thing I'm talking about these days, because we love the tailwinds. The tailwinds are great, but tailwinds do not remove choke points. We still have the choke points. There are still problems. It is also the case that from a macroeconomic level, these kinds of problems just take care of themselves, but in reality, they don't. They really need focus and attention to be resolved. Number one issue for me, human capital. Where are the people who are going to pull this off? And not just scientists and engineers, who we also need, but where are the specialty welders? Where are the power electricians? Where are the agency personnel who will permit these things? Where are the communications experts who will carry a narrative, who will engage the communities where these projects will live? We need people to do all of these things. And absent these people, we're going to struggle. It will take extra time. And time, by the way, turns into debt. Time turns into doubt. We really don't have the time to waste, so we really need to get more people in there. A corollary to this is true really in sort of a North American or European context, less so in other parts of the world, just the permitting itself. We really have to focus on getting to yes on a bunch of things. I was recently in Denmark and learned that in a place where they love offshore wind, and offshore wind is their favored child now, to permit an offshore wind project takes 7 years. That's crazy. Now talk about trying to permit a CCS project in a place like Colorado. It's just hard. It just takes time. Or Italy at the Ravenna cluster or something like this. We have built an apparatus that is cautious, but unfortunately that doesn't serve the interests. As Assistant Secretary Crabtree had mentioned, these are very much cross-sectoral challenges. We have to get to yes, not just in the steel sector, but also in ports, also in subsurface, also in surface facility siting. And in developing countries, we also want to provide energy access and equity. It's just a lot of people. It's just a lot of sectors, and we have to get permitting and agreement across all of those. And so those are the challenges which I think are most immediate with respect to the world of carbon capture and getting that deployment.
Thank you. Beth, what challenges? I think the workforce piece is really, really important, and that's not just for carbon capture and storage. As we're thinking about kind of this vision for a decarbonized energy system, it's really across next-gen technologies. But maybe you can talk a little bit more about the region-centric barriers to deployment and also the learnings that your facility has delivered and how it's being proliferated across the globe.
Yeah, thanks, Lee. And you know, that's something I talked about a lot previously. And, you know, when I think about regional specific, for the Saskatchewan, Alberta area in Canada, we're actually more regionally specific to like Montana, North Dakota, Wyoming than we are to Quebec, where there's so much hydro. And so sometimes regional doesn't always mean your country or that, you know, specific element. And I think that's going to be something that's really important as well as we're developing hub infrastructure across a regional area of storage. And you know, storage doesn't have boundaries. CO2 doesn't have boundaries. This is something that I think is something that we need to think about as well. Something that I've really been pushing and think is very important is if there are public dollars going towards these projects, there should be public knowledge that comes from them. And so actually in the investment tax credit that came out of Finance Canada, there is a provision for the tax credit. In order to get it, you actually have to share knowledge. That's still being defined, which is a good thing. You can drive a bus through it, which was our intent. But having that knowledge sharing attached to actually getting the money, super important, I think. The Emission Reductions Alberta is financing a lot of the feasibility studies and FEED studies that are going forward for the projects that are happening in Alberta, Canada. And with that, the first 200 hours of every project, the Knowledge Center actually has to work with the companies that are going to be developing the project. So it's actually ensuring that there's an injection of the past learnings into these projects, as well as because we're working amongst all those projects, we know the tie-ins and the differences between them. So those types of things are actually innovative and creative ways that we can ensure that, you know, with these money, with these investments that we're putting forward from the government, it's not just these one and done type concepts. And when we look at, the global knowledge sharing and taking that beyond, it's not just the money that are going to go into these projects to ensure that they're happening. I mean, that's super important. But things like Article 6 of the Paris Agreement can really open the opportunities for markets for technology transfer and clean development mechanism, and making sure that we take things like the United States projects when we go to Saudi Arabia, for instance, or go to Nigeria, and ensure that there may be even credit reduction opportunities back in America for the technology transfer into these other countries. And there are ways that you can do that in your contracts to ensure that there's a balancing back.
Thanks, Beth. And I want to zoom into one aspect that you mentioned, CO2 storage, cross-border CO2 storage. Every country has emissions. Not all countries have access to CO2 storage. In fact, our very own CEO will be discussing this later at the Bologna Pavilion. But maybe, Fahad, we can go to you. Since KAPSARC has done a lot of work on CO2 storage commercialization, also thinking about global business models, how does this factor in for the region, and what do you think are the next steps?
So, like you mentioned, CO2 storage sites do not recognize national borders. And this is, I think, one of the ideas that Saudi Arabia actually proposed during the last Green Initiative, which is a regional CCS hub. So the regional hub that would help, countries that are small when it comes on the scale of emissions, like Bahrain and Qatar, but that are close to Saudi Arabia and could have access that would be cheaper than actually developing their own storage site, given the limited emissions they have. So I think that's one area that we see helping implementation. The second, I think, is supply chain. I think we're seeing in all kind of projects, not even CCS, but we're seeing it even renewables and other, that the cost of capital has gone up. Supply chain bottlenecks have caused projects prices to go up. And so that's important because we're especially coming with a lot of projects for CCS. And it's very important to get those supply chain, working to deliver those projects and cost. Because I think if you go to any person, the first, issue they have with CCS is all projects are behind schedule and, they have high cost, higher than planned. And so getting them on cost, on schedule is important, especially when we're going with so many projects.
Thank you. And I just want to echo this because this is so important that we make sure we're delivering these projects on time. We can get steel in the ground to also build trust in these technologies. So maybe, Mohammad, you could elaborate a little bit. Because of this kind of unprecedented or inflection point of policy, we've also seen a lot of business sector activity, particularly in the region. We're seeing new companies, new stakeholders. How does this improve the landscape and help address some of the challenges that we already discussed in terms of infrastructure, workforce, permitting?
Okay. Yeah, I think let me start by saying when we look at CCUS globally, it's important to appreciate the differences in the regions. So what could be the business model in North America or Europe would be different from the business model in Africa or the Middle East or China. So that's a very important baseline. So we know what will be the type of challenges and opportunities that will evolve in every region. Like if we focus closely on the Middle East and Africa, CCUS has been driven by government and national oil companies. We start seeing recently involvement of other sectors and other companies where interest coming in the steel industry, the cement industry, aluminum smelter, and even the finance sector started engaging a lot in the dialogue, how CCS can be part of their clean energy or sustainable funding in the future, what could be the contribution, what could be the challenging for that. So there have been some good indications and good steps. What's needed more in the region, as Fahad said, is the cross-border collaboration is very essential and important. CO2, when it's emitted, it doesn't recognize borders, and we want to store it, it shouldn't recognize borders. So it will travel across borders, and we need to bring in new countries and in new stakeholders into the game. Still, in most regional countries, the private sector, when it comes to the oil and gas sector or other sectors, are not completely involved in the announced projects in a way since there is still no clear incentive how that will be done. So these need to be evolved so we can see more and more players coming into the CCUS projects. So in a way, it's a challenge, but in the same way, it's an opportunity to drive CCS with the involvement of more sectors and with the support of the government, let's say, for the first phase of projects that will come on board.
Great, thank you. And I saw your hand, Julio. You wanted to come in here? And please, for the audience, we're going to go into the Q&A section very soon, so we're looking forward to your questions.
Very briefly, I wanted to build on something that Mohammad had said. One of the things that we know about CCS is that for some technologies it's very good, like steel or fertilizer. And what we are beginning to see is that some countries are using CCS as a way to build their domestic industries around these things, such as clean fertilizer, clean steel, clean chemicals. That is an opportunity actually for cross national collaboration in standard setting, specifically sort of a club of nations to elevate the floor of what clean means, and in doing so actually attract a green premium which will support more future investment. And so I'm seeing the very beginning of this sort of virtuous cycle where CCS creates an opportunity for domestic industry growth, which creates an opportunity for standards and collaboration.
Thank you so much, Julio. Very important point. And I think that's actually a perfect segue to go over to you, Eadbhard. Let's talk a little bit about standard setting in the European context, but also we already hit on a lot of pieces and challenges that we'll need to overcome to really make carbon capture and storage a reality at scale. Supply chain, workforce, financing. How do you see all of this play out in the European space? And potentially, how are different stakeholders working together to really accelerate and take the learnings that we're already seeing play out in other places to deploy the technologies faster?
Yeah, so in Europe, the industrial sector is very much under quite a lot of strain at the moment, given the current energy crisis. And I think one of the biggest learnings that the energy crisis has taught us is that a single reliance on sort of one source of energy or one solution as a sort of way of the future is very much a problem. And a solution like carbon capture needs to be considered among all sort of tools in the toolbox, let's say, of reaching climate neutrality, and rather than focusing on single solutions like we just need to electrify everything or we can use hydrogen for everything. Carbon capture has a really advantageous position in the sense that it can be very much used in various different applications. If we want to use hydrogen in the steel sector, for example, but we're not going to be able to reach sufficient volumes of clean hydrogen from renewables, that we're going to need hydrogen from other sources too, carbon capture can play a role there too. So I think very much the learnings that are currently going on during the current energy crisis is that we very much need to adopt more of this optionality concept, that we're very much going to need a lot of different tools in the toolbox if we're going to reach a climate neutral industry in Europe. And I think we like to model ourselves very much as Europeans that, you know, we want to lead the way. We want to lead the way, that, you know, we want to be one of the first climate neutral regions in the world. But at the same time, you know, we're currently under quite a lot of stress in the energy sector. But I think when we look at how we're going to scale carbon capture and storage, it's very going to have to be led by the rich industrialized countries, and because these are the countries where we've already accelerated wind and solar, and we're very much going to need to do the same for other climate technologies, not just CCS. And I think that's very much the focus that we have to take, that we're going to try and reach a climate neutral industry in Europe that's going to take on a lot of different tools in the toolbox, and carbon capture is going to be one of those big important tools that we're going to need.
Thank you so much. I'd like to invite the audience. Any questions from the audience? Over there. We'll get you a microphone. Okay, I'll come.
Hello, hi. Thank you very much for your presentations. My name's Vicky Coatman. I work for ERM, a sustainability consultancy, and also here on behalf of the Carbon Capture and Storage Association. I'd like to hear the views of the panel around how carbon capture can actually support broader societal benefits. We've just finished a study for the Humber cluster in the UK, looking at the societal aspects and asking the question, really, what's it going to take to maintain public support for carbon capture and storage and other industrial decarbonisation technologies. And it came out very, very clearly that kind of a just transition lens on this is really important. So I'm really interested in the UK, there is quite a discussion about levelling up but there's very little in the way of kind of policy mechanisms and teeth to underpin that. So I'm really interested to hear the views of the panel of what can governments put in place that will really assist this kind of massive investment to improve levelling up and just transition, both within jurisdictions but also between jurisdictions.
So if I may go first and then cut to Beth and others. First, the things that require no government help where CCS provides an advantage, it reduces pollution. CCS reduces pollution. CCS reduces pollution. It reduces volatile organic carbons, it reduces NOx, it reduces SOx, it reduces particulates. People who say otherwise are not being honest. You start by saying we're taking a smokestack and we are cleaning it. Okay, so that's an immediate benefit that comes to communities. Other benefits that immediately come to communities are sustained jobs or new jobs. In many cases, they're getting revenues and tax base, which they would not have had otherwise. All of these things are very real. And for many groups like organized labor or for community health organizations, these are things they can embrace. I will say in the United States, we have a bit of a model here already, Justice 40, in which we say, hey, we're going to spend 40% of the government money in a context in which disadvantaged communities that are historically disadvantaged will benefit from the government investment. So there's an opportunity to do better there. One idea is to see if there's a way to internationalize that same sensibility and do more of that. I think that the idea of sort of quotas and hard targets is probably problematic in this context, in part because the technology changes. There's already costs involved and you want to manage the costs well. But I think there are some very straightforward things that can be done and that already come from this. The last thing I'll say is that, as to my earlier point, it is a magnet for new industries. It is a magnet for new jobs. And many countries are reaping the benefit of that. That narrative needs to be told more clearly and well.
Thanks. So at the Boundary Dam project in Saskatchewan, it's a carbon capture and storage facility on a coal-fired power plant, and it has the ability to reduce 90% of the emissions there. There were 5 million man-hours in the building of that facility. So the job opportunities extend across also trade unions. So you have boilermakers, electrical workers. It's, quite vast. The term just transition has become a little bit of a sword, actually, among some of those unions. And there are support for just transition, but also it's looking like the ending of an industry at some times. So when you look at coal, for example, the fact that you can operate those facilities, and I know the U.S. is looking at doing CCS on some more coal plants, et cetera, it is actually to the heart of the communities. And so when you're talking about societal buy-in, a lot of these industries have been there for years. That's where their family works. That's where the dad works and the mom teaches at the school, for instance, and the kids grow up knowing it. So I've been really fortunate to meet the people that actually are behind these things. And when you actually get to talk to them and talk about the value, talk to the Boilermaker that made the project and understand how that contributes to the future of their child, and it really is impactful. The trust that you can gain from a face-to-face interaction is immeasurable. And so when you're dealing with societal impacts, you've got to get on the ground. And you can try and reach everybody. I can tell everybody how proven it is. I can tell how many man-hours there were. But going there and talking to Bob really is what made the difference in making the project successful.
Thank you, Beth. And I think we have another comment on this topic from Assistant Secretary Crabtree, and then I'm seeing a question over there.
I just wanted to add very briefly in your question, and it picks up on what Julio said. Not only is there that fundamental linkage that when you deploy carbon capture, you reduce pollution from other sources beyond greenhouse gas emissions and all the economic development and jobs opportunities. We're taking an extra step at the Department of Energy with the funding from the infrastructure bill that I mentioned. If it's a project that's getting funding, if industry is getting funding from the department under the infrastructure bill, we are actually have, in terms of community engagement, Justice 40 for environmental justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and then workplace development. All those are factors that we evaluate and rank in terms of whether we provide funding or not, in addition to the technology aspects of it.
Thank you, Brett. And I think we have one more comment over here and then a question in the back. Perfect.
Thank you very much, panelists. Great insights shared by all of you. You gave the example from the Canada and especially the power generation based on the coal. We all know that it's the carbon capture is capital intensive, it's not economically viable. So how can a power generation company make a business case for the carbon capture and in the current circumstances, especially if that utility company is based in, say, not in this region, but the developing, the country. That's one. Second is, what needs to be done to achieve the inflection point so that the capture becomes more or in other words, I think, they are showing more willingness to embrace the carbon capture. Because you also highlighted benefits. So many of the benefits would be of societal in nature. But for a business case, how would I justify a carbon capture and go for it?
Okay, I think I want just to start on the cost. Now, we always talk about carbon capture being capital intensive and being expensive. Now, from an engineering point of view, I always say for any technology to go down with the cost, we need to try it once and tens and times. So by scaling up and building multiple, cost will go down. Now, that's not an immediate solution. We need to work on developing more technologies, and we need to develop incentives for the private sector. Like in the opening of the panel, we heard about the Inflation Reduction Act in the state and how it made many of these CCS projects feasible with the link, with the tax refund, and so on. In other parts of the world, other models could be feasible for that sense. But I think initially, governments need to step forward for a certain period of time to push for these projects, and then business models will evolve, and we will see a reduction in the cost by building more and more of these projects. Solar energy happened in this way. Like in Dubai and Saudi Arabia, we are seeing very cheap solar energy projects being awarded because there was a push at the beginning, then things start evolving, cheaper manufacturing, and so on. And we are hoping if we push for CCUS with the proper business models, with the government support at the start, we might reach that point as well.
I'll just add that, I mean, we're seeing whether we call it a carbon tax or we don't call it a carbon tax, carbon has a price. And you see the EU having a carbon tax, but you see also regulation that actually impose an implied carbon price. And so we're moving somewhere down that. I don't think CCS today is ready in a lot of geographies just because the cost is high, there is need to scale up. But in a few years, I think in 5, 6, 7 years, I think regulation and carbon pricing would drive the business case for CCS in the future.
And just to add to the need for that carbon pricing piece, in Canada there's been a big discussion on certainty. And I think one of the things that you're talking about is the need to have certainty for industry and their investments, right? Yeah, and so one of the biggest obstacles to having the next wave of CCS projects was the lack of certainty in the investment and how the next government would come in and take away a carbon price. What the carbon price would be in order to ensure that if you're going to reduce those emissions, what the value of the CO2 is going to actually return on your investment. And so having a public good actually for the carbon capture storage, almost like where you're going to put the CO2, has actually enabled the Alberta, for instance, I'm just using it as an example, to have that as a cost benefit because the government is backing it. Enhanced oil recovery has been a cost benefit for a lot of projects that have moved forward. It's what the return on your investment is going to look like coupled with certainty, and I think that's something that's really important. We can talk a little bit more about it after if you want to. And I think there's also an obligation under like common but differentiated responsibilities. If there are an investment in your own country in the developed world, to get these projects going, what is your obligation to developing countries to ensure that these projects are going to go forward as well?
Yeah, let me pick up on that. I'll be super brief because I know we have another question. So for starters, it is unreasonable to expect developing nations to bear the cost of this. It just is, right? And that's okay. But these things are changing fast, and there's 3 ways to fix it. One of them is with technology. The technology costs are coming down fast. I want to mention one particular one, net power, where it looks like you could add a new power plant with carbon capture with no additional cost, or with very low additional cost. So the business case is clean with no extra money. That's how you get your rate case. Another opportunity, though, are these new financing mechanisms. Just recently at this COP, there was an announcement of US and Japan doing joint funding to Indonesia to slow the rate of coal growth and to help them deploy renewables. I can imagine a similar mechanism developing which would support CCS deployment in a place like India or Nigeria as a way to rapidly reduce the emissions. That doesn't exist yet, but that would be another way to defray costs.
Hi, I'm Anushree from MIT, and we're actually working right now on trying to mitigate community opposition to utility-scale renewables, and it seems like they face a lot of similar bottlenecks in the siting and permitting process. And so I was wondering if the panelists have thoughts on successful policy frameworks that have kind of streamlined this process for developers and communities. New York State was the first state to kind of create in 2020 a streamlined process for utility-scale renewable siting that I guess we don't really know if it's been successful yet, so I'm curious for CCS and energy storage if there's something similar elsewhere.
So first of all, show me your rat. You're from MIT? Show it. There you go. Thank you. So we're running through this experiment right now in the US with permitting reform, and we'll see how we do. I personally think we dodged a bullet because we didn't shove permitting reform through. I think, though, that for the next few months in the next Congress, that's going to be a very active discussion. What can we do that makes sense? My personal opinion is this is not a policy issue. We can fix some things with policy, but really this is a narrative issue. This is a collective action issue. And really what we need to do is we need to build enthusiasm for the better world in which we will live. It is easy to be a buzzkill. It is easy to say you're bad and no. But we actually have to evolve to a different state where we say, I'm excited about working together. I'm excited about getting to yes. I'm excited about pollution reduction and new industries and jobs and improved trade. I'm looking forward to the future of the world that I want to live in. And if we work collectively together to build that story, then that's what will deliver it.
Great. Anyone else wants to chime in here? Okay. Lightning round.
I just want to say that CCS is a little bit different to renewable, that you don't need these huge spaces. And so that makes it a little bit easier. Not easier, but a little bit easier.
Thank you so much. This is an incredibly important point as we're considering the transformation of the energy sector. We also need to keep in mind land use alongside workforce and infrastructure concerns that we, I think, have unwrapped really amazingly in this panel. So I want to thank you all so much and the audience for this really interactive conversation. I think there's a new narrative for carbon capture and storage successfully driven by region-centric strategies, unprecedented policy momentum, inflection point, we heard it earlier, and we're taking key steps to evolve and improve the policy framework as we're going along in all the regions. So our next conversation, which is going to start in just a few minutes, will actually talk about a few points that Julio and everyone actually has highlighted. Okay, so we have these region-centric strategies. We have key investment building blocks in the US, Europe, and the Middle East, but how are we actually going to deploy the technologies globally? What's needed to unlock financing for emerging markets, developing countries? So I'm really, really excited, and I'm so grateful for this amazing panel, for this amazing audience, so engaged. Please join us in a couple of minutes, and thank you so much.